Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Greg Robson. I'm an associate research professor in the Business Ethics and Society program. So welcome to Ethics Week. If this is your first day with us, and if you came yesterday, thank you for coming again. Should be a really interesting conversation. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Kristen Collett-Schmitt. Professor Collett-Schmitt is a leader and award-winning teaching professor at the university's Mendoza College of Business, as you know. She holds a PhD and Master's in Economics from North Carolina State University and a BA from Bellarmine University. And she brings economics to life for her undergraduate and graduate students. Just a bit more from her bio. So her innovative teaching methods, which emphasize real-world applications, have earned her numerous awards. I have a list here, by the way, of many, many awards that she's won. I can't possibly share all of them with you, but she has won the Outstanding Professor Award multiple times, the Leo Burke Outstanding Professor Award, the Women in Business Faculty Member of the Year Award, the Outstanding Teaching Award, and many others. So, well done.
Thank you.
And she's been named to a top 40 undergraduate business, named a top 40 undergraduate business professor by Poets and Quants. Professor Collett-Schmitt's scholarly work explores economics education, inclusive pedagogy, and financial literacy, all aimed at really inspiring student interest. She's also very kindly found a way to be with us today. She has other meetings, and she's, unlike many who have open time during Ethics Week, she just found a way to be with us. So I greatly appreciate that. So please join me in welcoming Professor Collett-Schmitt. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's good to see all of you. So the way that the next hour is going to work, I actually have class at 12:30, so I'm going to have to step out at that time. So the way we're going to structure the next hour is I'll start by sharing a few remarks on our topic today, kind of laying some foundational ideas around tariffs, economic impact, and the ethical dimensions of that. And then we're going to kind of shift gears towards the second half of the hour by posing some discussion questions for the large group. We hope you'll engage during that time, and Greg's generously agreed to facilitate that discussion session at the end. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts on this issue as well. So as Greg said, I'm an economist by training. I'm also a faculty fellow for the Notre Dame Center for Ethical Leadership. So thinking about the ethical dimensions of kind of economic impact and economic behavior is something that throughout the course of my profession I've been able to kind of find a synergy between, and I'm happy to share some thoughts today on this topic. So when it comes to tariffs, I think that this is a topic that we are all hearing a lot about over the last year. I taught last spring in both the undergrad and the graduate program, right when President Trump was elected to office. And I think all we talked about all spring was tariffs, right? Everyone was very interested in it, wanting to understand what was going on, what the impact on consumers and firms would be. And of course, that conversation continues today. And if you were at the Ethics Week discussion yesterday, you likely heard the speaker say that tariffs have been used to, influence behaviors for a long time historically. Our current president is not the first to do that. But of course, in our current culture, the ethics of that behavior is now a topic that is largely discussed, in society. And so that kind of brings us to where we are here today. All right, so we'll just kind of level set initially. Starting with, what is the economic impact of tariffs, and then we'll jump to the ethical dimension. Okay, so first things first, tariffs, of course, are these taxes on imports. They're meant to influence behavior. That is the intended consequence of these tariffs. When it comes to the economic behavior, what would some of you say are kind of the traditional expected economic impacts of a tariff? Tariffs do what in our economy?
Increased costs.
Yeah, increased cost, yep.
They protect American
traditionally they've been used to protect American manufacturers.
Good, yeah, so they incentivize businesses to change their production patterns, which lead to the protection of certain domestic industries. We have cost, right, the cost to consumers, cost to firms. And any other economic impacts that are kind of well known and established of tariffs?
Free trade.
Okay, good. That's trade patterns. Good, yeah.
Reduce demand.
Yeah, it's gonna affect the demand for goods and services as well as it impacts consumer behavior. Yeah, so I think, kind of we're pretty familiar just from kind of media, financial news and media interaction that there are some well-known effects, economic effects of tariffs, traditionally thinking about how they affect consumers and firms. And so prices, right, are prices going to go up? That's all my students and I talked about in the spring, kind of the uncertainty around that a year ago, because effect on consumers is largely focused on higher prices. And so as we see here on the left, in terms of consumers, we see higher prices, consumers changing their behavior to substitute towards maybe cheaper products, and if the tariffs are raising prices, that may be more towards domestic products. If everybody is then paying a higher price for goods and services, we then potentially see low-income households being disproportionately affected, right? Their purchasing power goes down. And so that then kind of raises the ethical question of, if tariffs are disproportionately affecting certain households, what are the consequences of that? When it comes to firms, right, now firms domestically now may gain an advantage when it comes to pricing power. They now be able to raise their prices, particularly for goods with a very inelastic demand, right, where consumers are not very sensitive to prices, because now the tariffs are working in their favor versus those organizations and firms abroad. So now firms have to think about how they're going to potentially change their production patterns. And so if production is now shifting more to domestic firms, firms abroad are going to think about whether they are going to absorb the cost related to the tariff, whether they're going to pass those costs off to consumers in the form of higher prices, or completely change how they produce their goods and services. Okay? And then it also may lead to some political implications, say through lobbying on behalf of those firms. Some of the other economic behaviors that we show here may be a little kind of less known, but important nonetheless. So kind of under this heading of investments in supply chain, here I think the impact on economic behavior is really uncertainty, right? And so investment is greatly influenced by uncertainty, and firms, make investment decisions more in the long term rather than the short term. And so when there's a lot of uncertainty that happens, that makes that long-term investment very fragile. In this space, we sometimes see firms exhibiting behavior like reshoring, friendshoring, or regionalization. So reshoring means bringing production back home. Friendshoring means relocating production to allies, like countries that are allies. And then regionalization means maybe, relocating the production to a more regional location. So in this sense, it's not so much the tariffs big or small, what goods or services the tariffs are levied on, but now predictability is the economic impact that is making it difficult for firms to make optimal business decisions. And that, of course, trickles down to consumers as well when it comes to that uncertainty. Next, we have the labor markets, which some of you noted in our earlier discussions, where we now see more domestic industries, maybe certain targeted industries protected as a result of the tariffs. We also tend to see downstream industries being affected by tariffs. So when we say downstream industries, we mean these firms that primarily rely on imports for inputs to the goods or services that they sell as their final good or service. So of course, if now those goods are becoming more expensive, then we're going to see changes in the production habits or patterns of firms for those final goods and services. You may be familiar with one real-world example of a tariff that targeted job protection as of late, and that was President Trump's tariff on steel and aluminum, right? And so that one was specifically intended to kind of bring the production more domestically and affect the labor markets the way that we have outlined here. And then finally, we've got, government and global systems. And so this is where we now see not just tariffs acting as a tax in the traditional economic sense, but now, affecting politics, potentially affecting trade agreements, policy and reform, which then leads us to conclude that while tariffs may historically been intended to affect economic behavior, it really extends beyond prices. And so now we're seeing, impacts on politics, on firms and consumers, and then also kind of the power dynamic in the global sphere. Okay. So then that, of course, then leads us to kind of the second question of kind of the ethics around that. And here, again, before we kind of open the floor to hear your thoughts on some of these issues, let's take a look at some of the kind of more traditional ethical dimensions that have been typically associated with tariffs in the past, right? And so, for me, these ethical dimensions are pretty much unavoidable given how much tariffs affect human behavior, affect every dimension of human lives. Of course, these ethical dimensions will be present. And for me, if I had to pick kind of one phrase to describe the ethical dimensions, it's trade-off. There always tends to be a winner or a loser, so to speak. Someone is benefiting, someone is harmed. So a lot of the questions that surround the ethical dimensions is, how do we weigh the two in relation to each other? How do we consider these tariffs? Right, so thinking about moral trade-offs. Some of the classical trade-offs that are mentioned with respect to tariffs are efficiency versus dignity of work, right? So if tariffs are meant to, bring work back home, for example, the domestic work back home, protect that work, that's protecting the dignity of our laborers. But without the tariffs, production may be more efficient. We've got specialization in trade. The countries that produce goods and services the cheapest and the most efficiently are doing that. And then, of course, tariffs stand in the way of some of that efficiency. So that's the traditional debate there. Consumer welfare in terms of prices versus protecting the worker and their dignity. And then, of course, this pits kind of the national stage versus the global stage, given that we're interacting with trade partners through the tariffs. There are issues of justice and fairness, right? So if we view trade as unfair, meaning that maybe one party to that trade transaction benefits more than the others, then are tariffs an ethical response to that? That's a typical question that has been asked. When we think about justice and fairness, are we thinking about rules, right? What the agreements of the tariffs might be, or are we more focused on what the outcomes of those tariffs are, right? And is it possible to kind of agree upon them or come to a shared understanding with respect to them? And then, who deserves protection, who deserves it more? And of course, the question about the consumers versus the laborers, as we mentioned earlier. Moving on, there's the distributional ethics, which again kind of reminds us that there's these trade-offs happening with tariffs, that consumers tend to be disproportionately harmed, but some industries and laborers disproportionately they're benefiting. So then, which one matters more and who determines that? And so, here we're talking about concentrated job protection versus regressive price effects. And of course, regressive price effects is thinking about how, the higher prices from tariffs may be affecting lower income households more than others. Right. And then finally, the question of whether tariffs should be used to leverage power or to gain power over other maybe underrepresented groups, right, in terms of the nations that may be bigger or more economically powerful than others, right? And we see a lot of that happening now with respect to using tariffs to achieve not maybe economic impact, but maybe other kind of political, goals as well. So again, the Trump administration now we've got some real world examples of how they've used tariffs as a way to achieve not maybe domestic protection of industries, but something else. Take the Mexican the tariffs in Mexico, and how those were meant to influence border protection, right? And not just, protecting domestic industries, for example. And then in the case of President Trump's first presidential administration, another example of this are the tariffs on China, where there he was intending to affect intellectual property and how that was managed and the innovation between the two countries. So kind of here, I think what stands out is that, there are ethical considerations about economic impacts, but given that tariffs also are now having these political impacts, policy impacts, power dynamics, we are now also seeing these other ethical questions around the government using tariffs to maybe make a statement about what's most important, what their priorities are, what their values are, who should be protected, how one should be protected, and so on. Okay, so with that was kind of my attempt to kind of lay some kind of basic groundwork for, again, kind of known economic impacts, non-economic impacts, and then some kind of traditional ethical questions that come up with tariffs. And so I have devised some questions then to help us continue this conversation as a group. We can go ahead and get started, I guess. First, maybe we could, open the floor up. I've got a couple more minutes before I have to head to class. Any comments or questions on kind of some of the thoughts that I shared here before we jump into kind of sharing more broadly as a group?
How established is the notion that if I raise tariffs, that it will bring back jobs?
Right.
Because there's, if one reads, there's evidence that, in the metal manufacturing.
Sure.
That the number of jobs has not increased.
Sure.
Dramatically.
Yeah, and for me, what we're reminded of is that it's for these types of industries, it's not just the fact that we import a lot of those goods and services. There are other factors that are influencing that industry, right? Thinking about environmental standards affecting steel and aluminum, right? Or other incentives or changes in consumer preferences that will just naturally change the way that industry works. It's not just about, what nations abroad have now taken over that production. So it may be one step in improving the domestic industries, but I think you're right. We don't have kind of a large body of evidence to suggest that that's the single thing that will protect those industries. I think that's right. And for me, I think, this is what I was telling my students, is like it's almost a waiting game. It takes such a long time for the impact of the tariffs to happen, for production to be reconfigured, for the workers to be retrained, to scale up the production. And I don't know, have we often given ourselves enough time in history to see all those things work out properly for the industry to recover domestically? Yeah, so I don't think we've seen that. I think you're right about that.
Other questions or comments?
Just a comment.
Yeah.
Given the uncertainty in the marketplace right now, in the political uncertainty,
Yeah.
at least what I read is that a lot of US manufacturers are simply not ready to invest in manufacturing facilities
Sure.
in the United States until they see what happens.
Sure.
I think that you've seen some things that seem to appease the administration by particularly Ford moving some production from Mexico to the US versus Canada. I would suggest that they probably would have done that anyway, just
Yeah.
to balance out the
Sure.
production.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I just see a lot of uncertainty and a lot of corporations saying, we're not gonna put a long-term investment because it's gonna take us 3 to 4 years to put up a manufacturing plant.
Yeah.
And the reality is, we're never gonna make flip-flops in the United States again, no matter what the tariffs are. We can't overcome difference in particularly the labor quotient of the
Sure.
manufacturing process.
Yeah, I think so. I think the more tariffs become connected to, retaliatory efforts or trying to leverage power to, to achieve political goals or policy reform. I think the more we do that versus use tariffs in the economic sense, that's where the uncertainty comes from, and it grows as we start to use tariffs for these other purposes. And for me, when it comes to our current presidential administration, we saw such an abrupt implementation of some of these tariffs that, I think it leaves the door open to say, well, how do we know that's not going to abruptly just change in the next administration, right? And the administrations are short. And so the flip and the flop and the uncertainty around that, I think it makes it really hard for businesses to make their optimal decisions, yeah.
Yeah, I would suggest that going forward, most corporations have a 3 or 5 year plan.
Sure.
And regardless of what administration is in the White House, you may alter that a little bit, but long term, it probably
Yeah.
doesn't change it much.
That's right, it needs to be independent
Yeah.
of the political dynamic, although it's hard to see, it's hard to separate all of the different details at this point, yeah. Yeah.
Just in response, wouldn't you argue though that strengthening supply chains, if that's the goal of some of these tariffs, would in fact help you make these long-term plans if you can't count on one administration or other and uncertainty? I mean, we saw during the pandemic a massive supply chain crunch because of a global causal event. We saw a supply chain crunch in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine and there was a bunch of grain lost. I just feel like if we go to the question, intention versus outcome, if the intention is to protect American supply chains or whatever country that you are a part of, if the goal is to protect American supply chains and strengthen what's being done domestically, I don't think that's a bad intention.
I would agree. I mean, the supply chain we saw was so fragile.
Yeah.
Particularly with all the goods and services, particularly goods that were imported from other countries to make an end product in the United States. And we saw that when that disruption took place, it literally, in some cases, stopped some of the U.S. manufacturing. So I would agree, if we can strengthen supply chains domestically, that's going to help us. But just another comment, then I'll shut up. I think what the U.S. really needs to do is capitalize on what we really do good. I mean, there are some things that we're just not going to be competitive on, no matter how high the tariffs are. I mean, but there are a lot of things in this country that we do well, and I suggest we should capitalize and put a lot behind that. Aerospace industry for a while, medical and surgery, some of the stuff we really do well. Capitalize on that. Don't focus on trying to bring something back that it's never going to work here or be competitive. Yeah.
I'm curious if you've looked into any of the research or history on sort of great industrial powers from like the 17th century to the 19th century, and how almost all of them had mercantilist policies or protectionist, very strongly protectionist policies. Do you see in the economic research like today any look at that time period, or are people, researchers, PhDs, just looking at sort of the 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly not my area of expertise in terms of economic history. I don't know if you haven't seen any of that as well, but I do think that thinking about, where the US thrives now, like what industries it's best suited to thrive in are so different relative to those times that I'm wondering if considering some of those similar policies would even make sense in our current environment. But there's always something to learn from history. So yeah, good question. Yeah.
Have any of the tariffs, in your view, looking at this, been smart and helpful? Because I look at, like he mentioned, the grain and things like that. Well, we may have put a tariff to America can supply more grain, but at the same time we killed the aid, US aid, and now we had no customers.
Sure.
So it all just sat there. So it's like we're countermeasures. I'm trying to understand why threats like the threat that was made to France if you don't do what we want, I'm gonna put a tariff on champagne. Well, who gives a crap?
They do.
You know, I mean, well, they do,
Yeah,
but
they
they
do.
don't. It's like, it doesn't, it's not anything that's gonna make us have a bit more champagne production in the US.
Sure. Yeah.
So what, I'm still
Yeah.
trying to understand, I can understand the ideas of using tariffs, because there are situations where it helps.
Yeah.
But have we done that? Have the
Right.
tariffs that we put up done that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tariffs that we've seen so far have clearly demonstrated the trade-off that we talked about, right? That there might be some good that comes from, say, domestic production, but then there's this harm that's created, and so we grapple with which one outweighs the other, right? And so I think that's, difficult for a lot of us to decipher because we've not seen a lot of this play out recently, right? In terms of, thinking as a nation, where should our priorities be? How should values matter? And who gets to determine those things? But I think it goes back to this uncertainty, right? So again, like it makes sense to use tariffs in the economic sense, but like right now we're not only doing that. And so it creates confusion and that creates uncertainty. And I think for consumers, right, that they are, struggling to understand when their budgets are gonna be kind of more stable, right? And firms are trying to understand when they know exactly when the tariffs are gonna be levied, how big they're going to be, how long they're gonna last. So, yeah, I agree. I don't think we have enough evidence to actually say that, the tariffs have been successful because there is this kind of ethical layer that as a nation, I'm not sure how we solve that. Yeah. Yeah.
I think one thing we did not talk that much about is that the tariffs, they were changing really fast.
Sure, yeah.
So it's not
uncertainty, yeah.
only uncertainty for planning, but they were added, they were increased, they were reduced,
Yeah.
so that actually creates like at a corporate level a lot of issues.
Absolutely.
Alone, and then also how you process it, and planning goes out the window because
Sure.
it's just really hard to use, and then levying tariffs on your allies is another issue. It's an ethical issue, creates confusion, creates instability in the market
Sure.
because you suddenly up and
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah, and I think also what I'm observing is something that's different than in the past is kind of the public announcement around what a tariff could be or the threat of a tariff, then the threat's taken away versus that happening kind of at a negotiating table behind closed doors, right? That's kind of that's a difference I've seen. I'm gonna pass it off to you, and yeah, we'll go ahead and take your
Maybe
comment.
this is now a good time to transition to
Yeah.
more Q&A, but first let's thank Professor Collett.
Thank you.
All right, so this is a controversial topic. I want to lob some provocative questions at you. I want to get to as many of these as we can, but the first question is this. So it's a question about presidential power and policymaking vis-a-vis tariffs. Should we see tariffs as precision instruments? So traditionally they've been used, for example, to protect infant industries, so focus on one particular industry. So are they precision instruments to be used, or should they be a part of a broad policymaking toolkit to do things like increase leverage when it comes to dealing with the fentanyl problem or dealing with negotiations with China about IP? So what do you all think? The discussion of tariffs justified when we're talking about using tariffs to gain political leverage for various possible reasons. So let's go here and here.
I've been talking about.
No,
Well, in that case, let's go here and then here. Okay. See that?
fundamentally, my question in return would be, so what has changed when, most democratic parties have decided in years past that free trade was the way to go, that would be beneficial to everyone. So that would be my first question, fundamentally to understand how that would come out. If it's true that free trade is beneficial, considering many aspects, if not all, then there are two options in my mind. Either you go the trade route, which is a cheap tool, in my mind has been used in a very suspicious way. I mean, another question that has come up is a tariff used as a shakedown and fosters corruption. And I mean, that is the second side. But the other side would be, have we, another option is to basically modify or mitigate the ill effects of free trade. I mean, NAFTA has caused economic distress for certain parts of the economy and people, but there was nothing really done to mitigate what that meant for Main Street, as people say.
And standard economic theory, if you have sufficiently rational and informed traders, then trade will tend to be positive sum. It'll be win-win. There are different ways those ideas pull apart, win-win and positive sum. But you can think about it this way. Suppose you go out, you get on Amazon, you're going to buy something, maybe you're going to buy a shirt. You're willing to pay, I don't know, $40 for the shirt, but you get it for $32, you get $8 in consumer surplus. But if the vendor using Amazon is willing to sell it for as low as $25, but they sell it for $32, that's the market clearing price, then there's $7 made in producer surplus. So all in, it's a $15 increase in surplus. Now, this is standard economic theory. We all know we buy things that are bad for us at times and so on. So I think it'd be naive just to uncritically accept that view. But if you think about trade, there are millions of trades every minute. I did a calculation once. It might be every second around the world. So that's a lot of surplus that's created. So if tariffs constrain trade, you might lose surplus. On the other hand, there are very real considerations, and I won't go on too long, there are very real considerations about competition and much else besides that might justify, or at least seem to justify, tariffs in some cases. So any thoughts in response to that or the first comment? Anything in particular?
One of the things that tariffs have created is what decision makers don't like, and that's uncertainty. And the taco thing was, okay, Trump said this, 3 days later he said something else, and 4 days later he said something else. And what it creates is analysis paralysis, okay? The big corporations say, I don't know which way to go on this one, so I'm not gonna do anything until they finally make up their mind in Washington. And for my time as a budget manager at Johnson & Johnson, I saw analysis paralysis lead to what we call the Groundhog Days effect, okay? We'll wait until the groundhog comes out and then we're gonna make our decision, which means we're not gonna do anything for quite a while.
Yeah, it seems like there's a real danger of uncertainty, maybe radical uncertainty in the kind of Keynesian and Knightian sense, where it's uncertainty where you can't even assign probabilities to possible events. And you know, it can be, I suppose it can be politically valuable to inject uncertainty at times, but economically, certainly there are effects where companies don't know what to do. So there are different kind of games going on if you think about game theory. And companies can't be confident that they're going to invest safely if they don't know what the policy will be from one day to the next, et cetera. Yeah, you had a comment.
To go back to your original question of whether or not it should be within the toolkit of sort of governments or I guess the executive branch, I think you can make an argument that historically it's always been in the US toolkit. You mentioned that it was used to protect infant manufacturing in the early 1800s. It was used to, for a long time in antebellum United States, to curtail economic power of the South. It's been used to protect growing industries in the 1890s to see the US become the industrial giant that it was. It was used probably poorly in the 1930s to prolong the Great Depression. But regardless, I think I guess my comment is, I think this period of free trade that we've seen since the 60s to now has been sort of more of a blip, more of an exception rather than the rule. And so I would have a hard time seeing a problem with going back to the governmental toolkit, seen as every other government uses it as well.
Yeah, I can see how one might think of that as the rule or the norm, having lived through it, but if you take the long view of history, tariffs have been used fairly often. I want to turn to another question here. So let's get to this question first. And I don't know whether we'll have time for all of these, but should governments prioritize national resilience and sovereignty, even if doing so reduces global efficiency and harms poorer countries? So these are justifications given for the use of tariffs. Do you think the justifications pan out? And are these goals these goals. What do you think?
I think your mention of game theory is interesting and applicable here, and I don't know if harming poor countries, maybe that's a little bit loaded here, but the way I would look at it is more, in the classical economic model in theory, all actors are sort of treated the same, the welfare of all actors is treated equally, but if you're living in a world where nations have duties first to themselves before other nations, and you have maybe a situation like we've had where nations have imposed tariffs on us or done potentially nefarious things toward us, game theory, I think, becomes relevant. And in a lot of game theoretic models, introducing uncertainty is actually helpful to facilitate agreement or discussion, because if foreign actors that are adversarial to you know what you're going to do, they might not take your threats as credible. That can work both ways. So, like you said, if the probabilities are just completely unknown, who knows what that would lead to. But I do think, like taking a game theoretic model into this approach, you can definitely have a justification for injecting uncertainty to bring people to like a negotiating table and to facilitate better relationships.
So any thoughts on that, on the uncertainty and game theory?
Yeah, I just understand the flip side of that. Creating uncertainty would make your threats more credible, but it would also make your promises less credible. So it's two sides of the coin.
I suppose that might depend on how often one keeps one's promises, right? Okay, interesting. Other comments? So game theory is the study of strategic human interaction. And we can ask a hypothetical question. So I'm trained in philosophy, so let me throw a hypothetical out there if I may. Okay. So is there a point at which say you have two countries, okay? Country A and country B. Country B has a 5% tariff, say on all goods, just to make it simple, coming from country A. Is there a point at which that 5% number gets so high and so bad that tariffs become justified? So if we go from 5% to 7%, there's a 40% increase, is it justified then? What about 10%, 20, 30, 50, etc.? Any thoughts on that? Is there a justification in principle for tariffs as part of a strategy in this way?
Can you give an example of what you're talking about instead of just numbers?
Yeah, sure. So suppose you have two countries, and one country has a really, like a small tariff, and then that country...
On what product?
Pick any product you'd like. So oil, for example. Suppose we're talking about a tax on oil imports. Country A is exporting oil to country B. Country B has a tariff taxing that import, and it's a 5% tariff. It's a small, let's call that small tariff, and then it goes up to 7%. And then it goes to 10%, and then it goes to 20%, and then 50%. Is there a point along the way where country A becomes justified in imposing a counter tariff strategically on any exports from country B? What do y'all think?
I would agree.
You would agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's done right now. I mean, look at EVs from China. I mean, you don't see any Chinese EVs here because there are significant tariffs placed on Chinese EVs. And that is because China subsidizes their EV production.
Other thoughts? Or does anyone have thoughts on at which point, if tariffs would be justified, is it 3%, 5%, 10%, 40%, if they'd be justified as, again, a counter-strategic measure?
Well, the thing that I don't understand is why we didn't use tariffs to protect the steel industry and we let that go away. And why we did do tariffs on all the manufacturing, like all clothing goods. None of that's done in the United States. We didn't set tariffs up to stop them from bringing in all that stuff. I mean, even, Apple built all their phones in China. They could have built them in the United States, but they didn't. I mean, I think tariffs, they're playing a game of making you think tariffs is some real big weapon, but it's never really been used. We didn't save any of our manufacturing in this country with tariffs.
respond to? Yeah.
But I'm just looking at, like, sometimes there's a point where you have to look at, is it efficient to have that manufacturing here without the price going up so much that it becomes unaffordable? You know, so that, and some industries, like for instance, if you look at steel, in my opinion, it might have been an industry that was really prevalent and worked really well here in the 19th century, but for multiple reasons, like resources and whatnot, cost of labor and all the other things, it became not that competitive. So you have to factor that competitive pricing, and is it like actually reasonable to even expect manufacturing to come back? And plus, manufacturing, if you want to bring it back, requires investment, and you know that right now, if you have instability, investment is not going to happen. So there is like, this one is not like a simple scenario, and it's not like I'm just going to bring it back and you have instant ramifications. Unfortunately, some things are not going to be reasonable to think to bring back.
I think a lot depends on the complexity of economies. So human societies are said to be the most complex entities in the known universe, partly because the human brain itself is the most complex object in the known universe. So you get 340 million people in the US and 1.4 billion in China and in India. You get a lot of complexity. It's hard to predict how an economy will develop. So if you say, for example, we should have a tariff, and the tariff will protect an infant industry, and that industry then will have time to develop, well, presumably, and this is my opining, so I offer it for your consideration, presumably there's a point at which the protection should be removed after the infant industry has been given sufficient time to develop. Now, there are big debates about whether that even worked in, say, the US and elsewhere, and much else to say, but I'll stop there. So another hand up. Yeah. No.
Yeah, I guess going back to this question and tied in with what we were talking about, yeah, like if our tariffs are actually harming the poorer countries, I mean, I think it's good to ask ourselves the question, like, why are some of the things for us so cheap thanks to free trade? Is it because there are people working in horrible conditions, not being paid very much, and that's why it's so cheap for us, right? So it's like, maybe actually the tariff would be helping them because it's also forcing them, like, we are no longer buying those things at such a cheap rate for such a bad reason, right? Like, going back to the ethical implications.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because is it our problem? Like, is it my fault? Is it our fault that these countries have not the best dignity of work? I mean, that's an interesting question in itself, right? Like, I mean, I guess you'd say to a certain extent we are all responsible, but we also have to prioritize, right? But like here in our country, no one would ever work in that kind of condition. Well, that's not true. I'm overstating, but sort of, right? Like we're not accustomed to seeing that. Apple was scrutinized highly for, oh yeah, we have these phones and these people are working, are dying, they're killing themselves because the conditions are so bad. So, could tariffs help with that?
That's a very, very important question. So like how many of you, by a show of hands, have worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 90 degrees inside a factory? Not me, probably nobody in here. So that's a deceptively, in a way, complex issue that's really important. I write on the dignity of work. I'm very interested in it, and I think it matters a great deal. It's tricky because economists, at least last I read, in sweatshops, for example, and there are different kinds of sweatshops. They call sweatshops for a reason. The working conditions are very difficult. And there are terrible sweatshops and ones that are bad but not terrible and so on. But economists say that people go to work in sweatshops because they make 3 to 7 times the income doing that than they could in other lines of work. And if that's the case, if those sweatshops go away, suppose they're an affront to human dignity. And in that respect, it seems to me that it's good, kind of. On the other hand, if people are launched back into worse poverty, where that first small bit of income makes a disproportionate positive difference, then what should we think about it? So I'm genuinely unsettled, but I think those are some things to consider. Yeah.
To add on to Helen's point, I think it's also important to consider that a lot of these sweatshops and positions where these countries have these tariffs are homogeneous economically. It usually ends up, it's not a diversified economy. So if for some reason that economy, that product, whatever it is bad that year, or countries decide to break it up, or that product goes out of style, what happens to these workers, to the sweatshop, all of that. Whereas if the industry is slowly weaned off, there's a chance for economic diversification, but that ultimately that's up to the business leaders and governments of those individual countries on how to influence decisions within their own country.
Again, the last part, there's a great question kind of in the background of all of this, which is really whose call is it? So one thing in ethics is to consider the outcomes or consequences of various policies. I think of ethics as about the life well lived, so we can think about policies, and the ethics of tariffs in particular is about the impact they have on people's lives. Do they let us all live better or worse, or how does that shake out? But then there's also the question of whose call it is. So even if tariffs would have a better or a worse outcome, there's a question about who gets to make the decisions about whether there should be tariffs, and on what, and when, and under what conditions, and for what reasons, and on what industries, and so on. All right, let me turn to another question. So when tariffs protect jobs in one industry, we've been talking about this, but they raise costs across the economy, whose harm counts more ethically or should count more? So if tariffs raise costs, but they protect jobs, the way I'll put it is, what matters more? And should we put more weight on the protection of jobs, or preempting or mitigating increased costs for many or all consumers? Not an easy question, but what do you all think?
It may depend on the industry.
Do you have the answer?
It may depend on the industry, because if tariffs protect jobs, say for example for Caterpillar tractor, that turns out heavy equipment and that type of thing, and with the growth of infrastructure not only in the States but also throughout the country. So the question is Caterpillar's gain worth more than the harm of people buying the equipment and that type of thing? And that's a hard question to answer, right? Yeah.
For sure. We've got about 8 minutes left, so I really want to throw it open. So if you have comments or on that question I just asked, or any others, feel free. But I want to kind of just throw it open. Feel free to take a look, maybe take a minute to look at these questions. And I want to hear your thoughts on these questions from Professor Collett-Schmitt. Otherwise, you'll be stuck listening to me, which I wouldn't want to impose upon you. All right, yes.
Well, I have a problem with this idea of that the tariffs were used, we put tariffs on these countries to get us to do what we want them to do, to stop fentanyl production. Except we put a tariff on Canada that doesn't produce fentanyl. Instead, that's the reason for it. It's like saying we're gonna put a tariff on Ireland because they produce too many ice cubes. Well, they don't have any ice cubes.
Does anyone have an explanation for that, the Canada fentanyl case?
It's a shakedown. It's just, I mean, it's softening it's lopping shells over the lines to soften the defenses with the goal, oh, we want Canada, oh, we want green.
Destabilize the approach to foreign policy, threats and intimidation via tariffs.
So not really the carrot, but the stick, or at least serious monetary threats.
I guess my question on the whole thing is, who makes the decision, whether it's the executive branch or the legislative branch? You know, the Supreme Court's going to decide that, but how would that make a difference in terms of complexity of making decisions, especially if it's legislative compared to the executive?
Does anyone have thoughts on that? Who gets to decide, say the executive or the legislative? Is there a danger of one or both branches having unilateral power over tariffs? Or are there pluses, are there benefits? What do you all think? Especially students who haven't spoken much yet. If you haven't said anything, feel free to chime in. Let's go here and then here. Yeah.
Well, obviously, there's a danger in having any branch of too much power, but I'd say probably, I'd say make the call probably legislative. The legislative is one that typically deals more, in foreign policy, to at least declare war, they are more representative of what people want what modern people want because they were elected more recently with the 2-year terms. But they reflect the people's opinion on foreign policy more accurately than the legislature. But obviously, different branches make different decisions for a lot of things.
So the legislature might, the Congress might be more broadly representative of the whole populace. And then there's a question, a surprisingly, I think, difficult and complex question of how much power is too much power for one branch? What kinds of power are we talking about? Can we have different kinds of power can we make one determination about all kinds of power? Are there different kinds such that there's no single dimension on which all of them vary, so they're really hard to compare? Just something to keep thinking about. Yeah.
I think, to his point, I think the legislative branch has the power to, should have the power to control tariffs and dictate to some degree how long they're in place for and what the limits are, but I would suggest that at this point, they've given up that power to the executive branch currently. That's, I think, what's happening. They have the power, but they seem to just give it up to the White House. Currently.
They've ceded their power, they've been too deferential.
That's what appears to be happening, at least in my view right now.
We have time for maybe one or two more comments. Yeah.
I just have a very quick one. I really think the biggest danger is that the checks and balances that were created among the powers are not working. You know, and that is because there are checks and balances built into everything. And right now, I think the executive branch is really overstepping its boundaries, and the judicial and legislative branches are not responding accordingly how they should.
Yeah, there's the kind of real-time effect, and then also that sets a precedent. Just like if you do virtue ethics, you think about an action. If you perform one particular action, all else equal, it often makes you more inclined to do the same thing over and over and over. You set a precedent. Same thing for various personal policies. So another hand up. So I'll give you the final word here.
Just an observation. There's a lot of issues and problems we're trying to address in economic and political and whatnot. It strikes me that if the only tool we look at is a hammer, every problem you see is a nail. And do we have the right tool for whatever it is we want to accomplish?
Very interesting point. All right, well, thank you all very much. We hope to see you again and appreciate the good comments. Thank you all.